Whether one approaches this subject as a historian investigating Jesus, or as a theologian seeking the roots of the Church's confession about Jesus, a perennial important set of questions focuses on Jesus' own understanding of his death and its significance. Did he indeed see it coming? And if so, on what basis? If he understood that his ministry would end in a violent death, how did that shape his understanding of that ministry and, indeed, his role in the story of God's interventions in the life of God's people? And then, of course, what is the relationship between Jesus' self-understanding in this regard and the interpretations of his death and its significance expressed and developed in the literary witnesses to the early Christian proclamation, that is, the New Testament? The texts collected in the Old Testament Apocrypha and Old Testament Pseudepigrapha are important witnesses to the matrix within which and the foundations upon which early Christian reflection on the death of Jesus took shape, indeed including Jesus' own understanding of his death. In this presentation, we will first review the two principal backgrounds documented in these texts, namely, the death of the righteous martyrs and the deaths of the prophets. And then we will explore together the significance of these backgrounds for the interpretation of Jesus' death, beginning with Jesus' own understanding of the same. The term martyr usually designates a person who chooses to accept death rather than violate his or her allegiance to a higher cause. In religious settings, this tends to involve refusing to compromise one's performance of one's obligations to God and the values or behaviors prescribed by God as delineated by the particular religious tradition to which one adheres. The word martyr, which also appears in legal contexts in Greco-Roman society to describe someone who bears testimony, hence the word witness as a translation of the Greek martos, highlights the public nature of this renunciation of life for the sake of piety, and hence the testimony that the witness bears. There is a message associated with the martyr's death, even if the message is as general as, "Our way of life is worth dying for." Although martyrs would be far more commonly and broadly celebrated in Christian literature and experience, the Western tradition of the religious martyr is chiefly rooted in Second Temple Judaism. While there are examples of martyrs earlier in Jewish literature, the martyr rises to prominence for the first time in texts written in the shadow of the Hellenizing Reform and the Maccabean Revolution. The Jerusalem elites, led first by the high priest Jason and then his usurper Menelaus, sought to refound Jerusalem as a Greek city with a Greek constitution, initiatives that were welcomed by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, who saw this as a means toward a more unified kingdom and welcomed the additional funds being promised for the privileges. Local infighting between Jason, Menelaus, and other parties led Antiochus to support harsh, repressive measures against continued observance of the Judeans' ancestral customs. The value of these customs became an essential rallying point for resistance. Despite the coercive measures employed, Jews were remembered to have resisted by persevering in their ancestral ways and their distinctive practices, even though this directly resulted in their deaths. The author of First Maccabees mentions that those who preserved copies of Torah were put to death, and tells briefly of the execution, together with their infants, of Jewish mothers who had circumcised their babies. He also relates that many chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the Holy Covenant. No particular value, however, is attached to their deaths, except as a mark of their fidelity to their ancestral way of life. The author of Second Maccabees, however, a text generally held to be written in the late 2nd or early 1st century BC, offers dramatically expanded narration of those who refused to eat defiling foods as a sign of their acquiescence to apostasy, telling in detail of the martyrdoms of the aged priest Eleazar, 7 brothers, and the mother of the 7. The author sets these martyrdoms within an interpretative frame. On the one hand, He presents their torments, in keeping with the Deuteronomistic view of Israel's rising and falling fortune, as a manifestation of God's punishment of Israel, which has on the whole been unfaithful to the covenant, particularly in the persons of its Hellenizing high priests and aristocracy. It is a sign of God's mercy to punish God's people before their sins have reached the point of no return, as the author puts it in 2 Maccabees 6:12-17. The seventh brother, the final martyr to receive the author's detailed attention, voices a more nuanced hope in this context, however, namely that God would soon show mercy toward the rest of the nation, and indeed that their deaths, these martyrs' deaths, would bring an end to the wrath of the Almighty against the nation. The martyrs offer their lives thus to hasten the reconciliation with God that they expect would follow the period of chastisement. It is noteworthy that the martyrs die out of a refusal to break God's laws, not as a consequence of their own participation in apostasy, that is, not as a punishment that justly falls on them as individual transgressors. While they may suffer justly as part of the collective disobedient nation, they are also in a position to offer their lives to God out of innocence and obedience, as a plea that God would act favorably toward the disobedient nation. Within the narrative frame, the author suggests that God indeed accepted the martyr's plea, for in the immediately following scene, Judas and his armies enjoy their initial successes because the wrath of the Lord had turned to mercy. The date and provenance of 2 Maccabees both support the thesis that such reflection on the significance of the voluntary death of righteous, obedient martyrs, as one finds therein, would have been available to Jesus. It is not necessary, of course, to maintain that the actual martyrs had viewed their deaths this way, only that the author of 2 Maccabees joins the foregoing interpretation to the paradigm of the martyr's death in such a way that future martyrs could think of their own deaths in terms of bringing benefit to the larger group of people, particularly in regard to restoring God's favor toward a disobedient nation by an exemplary act of obedience and covenant loyalty. The martyrs in 2 Maccabees also give frequent and prominent expression to the expectation of vindication by God through resurrection, or in other texts, such as 4 Maccabees and Wisdom of Solomon, to some other form of life beyond death, suggesting that this, too, was an integral part of the paradigm, even as it appears to be an integral part of the passion predictions of Jesus in some form. A later text, 4 Maccabees, returns to the stories of Eleazar, the 7 brothers, and their mother, found in 2 Maccabees 6 and 7, using them as the focal examples that provide the climactic proof that devout reason, that is to say, the rational faculty that has been trained by following the Jewish Torah, can master the passions and thus achieve the moral ideal of the Greco-Roman sages. 4 Maccabees is a Jewish text written in Greek somewhere between Syrian Antioch and Cilicia, sometime in the mid to late 1st century A.D. While this text is too far removed in time and geography to be said to have exerted any influence upon the historical Jesus, it is valuable as a witness to Jewish reflection on the significance of the death of the righteous martyr as a parallel and perhaps mutually informing development to early Christian interpretations of the significance of the death of Jesus. The author of 4 Maccabees attests to a much more highly developed theology of the efficacy of the death of the righteous person than its source, 2 Maccabees. Both texts continue to view these deaths as appeals to God for mercy, and both view reconciliation, and therefore God's saving intervention in the affairs of the nation, as the result of these deaths. In these two passages, however, the author of 4 Maccabees uses much more explicitly sacrificial and cultic imagery to describe the efficacy of the martyr's death. On the basis of his voluntary obedience to the point of death, Eleazar prays, "Be merciful to your people, and let our punishment suffice for them. Make my blood their purification, and take my life in exchange for theirs." After the martyrdoms of all 9 figures, the author elaborates upon their achievement in cultic terms, writing, "The tyrant was punished, and the homeland purified, they having become, as it were, a ransom for the sin of our nation. And through the blood of these devout ones and their death as a propitiatory sacrifice, divine providence preserved Israel that had previously been mistreated." The connection between the violent shedding of blood and the exchange of a life for the life of another, represented in the Greek word antipsuchon in the 4th Maccabees text, resonates with the fundamental principle undergirding the Levitical sacrificial system, namely that the blood of sacrificial victims was provided by God for the sake of making atonement between God and God's people. In Leviticus 17 we read, "As life, it is blood that atones for a life." The phrase anti tes psuches is probably the source, the antecedent of the condensed noun antipsuchon, which we find in the later text, 4th Maccabees. Moreover, the term hilasterion, which we encountered in 4th Maccabees 17, is related to the verb used throughout the Septuagint for propitiate, atone, or reconcile, and is itself used to describe or name the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, the place where atonement is made on Israel's behalf. While a human sacrifice is nowhere prescribed by Torah, in the absence of a functioning sacrificial system, as was the case during the period of these martyrs, the voluntary self-sacrifice of a righteous person is seen to function as would a sin offering, and can come to be regarded as a superior one, as in Hebrews 9:11-14, reflecting on the death of Jesus. The martyrs' deaths have 2 important results. God now acts favorably toward God's people to deliver them, and covenant obedience among God's people is revived. This introduction to the development of Jewish martyrology would be incomplete without looking at several prominent precursors. 4th Maccabees explicitly connects the martyr's predicament with the stories of Isaac, the stories of Daniel and the 3 youths in Assyria, who are seen as important prototypes of the martyrs. Second Temple period developments of the tradition of the binding of Isaac emphasized his voluntary consent to die in obedience to God's command. More significantly, Isaac's near sacrifice is believed to have beneficial effects for the people of Israel in their relationship with God. The merits of this obedient death result in the election of Israel. They are recalled before God in the Levitical sacrifices. They prefigure the Passover sacrifices, and they remain in God's memory to assure the favorable hearing of the prayers of Israel when in distress. The tales of Daniel 3 and 6 gained currency in the Antiochene persecution, when the visions of Daniel were probably composed. The story of the 3 youths who braved the fiery furnace rather than yield to the king's command to bow down before an idol anticipates the forensic or courtroom situation in which the martyrs would find themselves. The developments of this tale in Greek Daniel move in the direction of interpreting the obedient death of the righteous as an act that reconciles the people to God. Prayer of Azariah 15-17, for example, could be read as a petition offered by Azariah just prior to being thrown into, or upon being thrown into, the furnace, that the willing, obedient deaths of himself and his 2 companions would be accepted by God and have the effect of properly offered burnt offerings, and that their sacrifice of their lives would have an expiatory effect for the sins of the people that had led to Gentile domination in the first place. Up to the point of their miraculous deliverance, Daniel 3 is essentially a martyr text. The emphasis in these texts falls upon the obedience of the martyr as effective for the relationship between God and God's people, not the shedding of blood in and of itself. Sacrificial imagery is interpretive. At the heart, it is the obedience of the martyr that is effective. As such, martyr ideology is a development of the covenant theology of Deuteronomy, according to which the people's return to obedience effects the reversal of the covenant curses, using the imagery of the Levitical sacrificial system to communicate this, both because that sacrificial system provides a means for describing reconciliation with God, and because of the similarities between the ritual violence of sacrifice and the violent fate of the Jewish martyrs. The signal difference is that now it is the representative obedience of the martyrs, not necessarily the entire obedience of the whole people, that brings a return of covenant blessings to the larger disobedient nation. A second, closely related background to the deaths of the martyrs is the development of the tradition of the deaths of the prophets. The earliest witness to this tradition appears to be Nehemiah 9:26. Describing the period of the divided monarchy, the author writes that the people cast your law behind their backs and killed your prophets who had rebuked them so that they might return to you. While the historical books, together with the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, give ample attention to the witness of these prophets, they are rather lacking in regard to details concerning their violent deaths, save for the stoning of Zechariah in 2 Chronicles. The first century collection of Lives of the Prophets, however, provides a bridge between the scriptural tradition of the prophets as obedient witnesses to the requirements of God's covenant and the traditions of the prophets as martyrs, which is attested as a given of Jewish cultural knowledge in several early Christian texts, notably Matthew 23:29-26 and its parallels. Expanding the biblical tradition, the Lives of the Prophets tells of the deaths of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Micah, Amos, and Zechariah on account of their bearing witness to the word of the Lord, confronting the covenant infidelity of Israel and her rulers. Another text, the Martyrdom of Isaiah, a work that in its present form has clearly been heavily edited by Christian scribes but derives from a Jewish original, describes the persecution and martyrdom of Isaiah in detail, fully combining the prophetic and martyrological traditions. This is not to say that every prophet was remembered to have died a martyr's death on account of his or her witness to the righteous demands of God's covenant. Within the lives of the prophets, the majority still die peacefully. Nonetheless, the traditions about the violent deaths of prophets, about which the Jewish scriptures are silent, have multiplied significantly by the time of Jesus, who is thus well poised to regard himself standing in line with this tradition, perhaps even as the climax of this tradition, as the parable of the wicked tenants suggests. Examples of Jewish martyrs from this period could be multiplied, but I think we have enough background both on the martyrs who offer themselves to God on behalf of the people and who anticipate vindication by resurrection, and the prophets who are killed for their testimony, to turn to questions about the historical Jesus. The recovery of Jesus' understanding of his own ministry is vexed by numerous points, from the question of the authenticity of key sayings related to Jesus speaking about himself and his own death and its own significance, to the question of the adequacy of the materials deemed authentic to provide a sufficient basis for understanding how Jesus looked at his own impending death. But these two backgrounds suggest that Jesus would have had the necessary traditional resources at his disposal, both to foresee that his own prophetic witness could lead to his death if he persisted, and to embrace this end as an act that would bring benefit to others in their experience of God's favor. The Jesus tradition strongly attests Jesus' expectation that his ministry would end in a violent death at the hands of those whom he opposed. This is most apparent from the 3 passion predictions, which call special attention to this foreknowledge by their repeated occurrence. It is necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things, and to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be killed, and after 3 days to rise up. The Son of Man will be handed over into the hands of people, and they will kill him, and having been killed after 3 days he will rise up. Look, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, and spit upon him, and whip him, and kill, and after 3 days he will rise up. While the third of these passion predictions especially could be viewed as a saying adapted to the known course of events, scholar James Dunn has helpfully pointed out that the second passion prediction is not very much developed and displays a remarkable lack of specificity about the mode of execution. Hence, the tradition cannot entirely be dismissed as part of a tendency to articulate a defense for the crucifixion. The Synoptic Gospels preserve other Jesus traditions that articulate less fully developed expressions of this sense of impending martyrdom. How is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be despised? Are you able to drink the cup that I will drink, and to be baptized with the baptism with which I am being baptized? The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. You know that after 2 days the Passover takes place, and the Son of Man will be handed over in order to be crucified. Take, this is my body. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out on behalf of many. And this list leaves entirely aside the numerous attestations in John's Gospel to the same theme. According to Sidney Page, an historian and Jesus scholar, the historicity of the claim that Jesus expected to die a violent martyr's death is virtually assured by the number of sayings to that effect in the Jesus tradition. This topic is attested in multiple streams of tradition, in multiple forms, and often obliquely or subtly, the last point suggesting authenticity because secondary commentary would tend to be more explicit than what we find in many of these sayings. While it remains likely that many of the particular sayings underwent some degree of development in the history of transmission, the central premise that Jesus spoke in advance about his death as the outcome of his activity should be received as a solid fact. The tradition of the deaths of the prophets provides added plausibility to this claim, a tradition made poignantly pertinent by the arrest and execution of Jesus' cousin and perhaps mentor, John the Baptist, who clearly identified himself with the prophetic tradition. Jesus' predictions of his death need not be doubted on the basis of the reluctance of historians to believe that the future can be foreseen. Jesus had ample precedent for expecting his own demise without any recourse to the prophetic gift. The Q tradition particularly gives prominence to Jesus' consciousness of standing within this tradition of the prophets. Jesus assumes that the line of prophets constituted a line of martyrs from Abel to Zechariah. On this account, the wisdom of God says, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill and persecute, in order that the blood of all the prophets slain from the foundation of the world up to this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, killed between the altar and the sanctuary, may be demanded of this generation. Q shows Jesus preparing his followers for such resistance to their prophetic witness, and denouncing Jerusalem chiefly for its murder of the prophets who witnessed to the city's disloyalty to the covenant and called for repentance. Jerusalem is here particularly linked in the Jesus tradition with this tradition of the deaths of the prophets. In a saying peculiar to Luke, In this context, Jesus intimates that he goes to Jerusalem to meet a prophet's end. The next day I must be on my way, because it is not possible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. The parable of the wicked tenants, of course, places Jesus at the pinnacle of this tradition of martyred prophets. The Markan form conflicts with known details concerning the death of Jesus, details that Matthew and Luke both correct in order to conform the fate of the Son in the parable with the fate of Jesus, the Son of the Church's confession. Unlike Mark's take in 12:8, Jesus was not killed within the city, within the vineyard, Jerusalem. His body was not then cast out of the city. Matthew and Luke both reverse the order of these things. First, the Son is thrown out of the vineyard and then killed, so that the parallels with Jesus' own historical fate is clearer in the parable. Based on this observation, James Charlesworth reasons that the parable probably did originate with a historical Jesus, thus adding another witness to Jesus' consciousness of standing in the long line of rejected, murdered prophets, and that the Markan form preserves this original form more closely than the other synoptic Gospels. In Matthew's presentation of Jesus' activity in Jerusalem, Jesus' contemporaries popularly regard him as a prophet, and so gives evidence that they found Jesus' activity congenial to the paradigm of the prophet who confronted the powers that be at great risk to himself. Jesus' contemporaries are portrayed in Luke's Gospel as continuing to use the paradigm of the martyred prophet after the crucifixion to make sense of the outcome prior to their experience of the resurrection. Indeed, even after the experience of the resurrected Jesus, the paradigm of the prophet like Moses, whom the people handed over to be killed, remains prominent in Acts 3. An even more difficult question concerns whether or not Jesus ascribed value to his death in terms of having beneficial effects on the relationship between God and other people. Within the Jesus tradition, two texts principally attest to this possibility. The first is Mark 10:45, where Jesus says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The second is found in the context of the Last Supper. The recovery of the original wording is a matter of considerable debate, but there is general agreement that in the word pronounced over the cup, Jesus spoke of his blood being poured out for many, and described the cup as the blood of the covenant. The fracturing and distributing of the bread as my body is also performative of the interpretation of his death as undertaken on behalf of others. For this tradition, one must look beyond the tradition of the persecuted prophets and the interpretations of the deaths of martyrs. 2 Maccabees presents the deaths of the covenant-loyal martyrs as beneficial deaths for others within the framework of God's covenant, providing significant precedent to the interpretation of the death of Jesus. Indeed, 2 Maccabees may well have informed Jesus' own understanding of his impending death, as reflected in these two sayings. It was a tradition available to Jesus in his time and location, and likely to have received regular attention in the annual celebration of Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, as it's called in John's Gospel. It was also a living, growing tradition, as the developments in 4th Maccabees show. Indeed, Jesus' statements about his own death are a rather remarkable development of the same tradition in the same direction, as one observes in the statements placed upon Eleazar the martyr's lips in 4th Maccabees 6:28-29, or offered by the author of 4th Maccabees in 17:21-22 about the martyrs' deaths, as we reviewed earlier. The ransom saying, attributed to Jesus, resonates linguistically and conceptually with the interpretation of the martyr's death as an antipsuchon, a life given in exchange for others, in 4th Maccabees 6 and 17. The Son of Man came to give his life a ransom for many. Dunai ten psuchein anti polon. Psuchein and anti are both there, they're separated, but conceptually we see in effect the same idea as giving a life as an antipsuchon. Moreover, Jesus' emphasis on his blood poured out for others in the word pronounced over the cup at the Last Supper resonates with Eleazar's prayer that his blood, shed in obedience to God, should effect the purification of his fellow Jews and the restoration of the covenant relationship between God and the nation. The fact of translation aside, Jesus' Aramaic being rendered into Greek by the evangelists or by the oral tradition upon which the evangelists draw, the language attributed to Jesus stands significantly close to the language used in the martyrological texts. Post-mortem vindication was a firmly fixed facet of Jewish martyr ideology. This comes to expression most forcefully in 2 Maccabees 7, which specifically and explicitly envisions this vindication in the form of resurrection, the reconstitution of the physical body, but is also evident in Daniel 12. 4th Maccabees has conformed this expectation to the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, which also appears as the vehicle for post-mortem vindication in the story of the righteous person who was tortured and killed in Wisdom of Solomon 2-5. The expectation of vindication was therefore quite plausibly part of Jesus' own expectation for the sequel to his own death as a righteous person, though Dunn is probably correct to suggest this in terms of Jesus' expectation that he would take part in the general resurrection rather than enjoy a special intervention by God on his behalf and his alone, millennia before any general resurrection. At this point, however, it becomes necessary to consider another martyrological tradition in the Hebrew Bible, namely the suffering servant of Isaiah 52-53. Scholars have generally insisted that the Jesus traditions about a death on behalf of others must be derived either from the Maccabean martyrs or from the servant's song of Isaiah. I think we should look rather to the blending of these two traditions behind the early church's interpretation of Jesus' death, perhaps beginning with Jesus himself, rather than having to choose between them. After all, Jesus, in his own sayings, is commonly credited with the blending of the figures of Daniel's Son of Man and the suffering servant of Isaiah in Mark 10:45, a blend also observed in such early Jewish texts as a document about Melchizedek from Qumran and the parables of Enoch, 1 Enoch 37-71. This is all the more the case as the suffering servant paradigm may already have significantly influenced the presentation of the effective deaths of the martyrs. The suffering servant song, though perhaps originally meant to speak of the redemptive effects of Israel's sufferings on behalf of the Gentiles, or the suffering of a remnant within Israel on behalf of the sinful nation as a whole, could be read in a new light in the wake of the martyrdoms celebrated from the Maccabean period, and might indeed have fueled the author of 4th Maccabees' reflection on the significance of those martyrs' deaths. The servant becomes now a particular righteous person, whose sufferings and death become, by the servant's own self-offering and by God's action, the functional equivalent of an offering for the sins of the nation. The servant's mutilation and torment, his voluntary offering of himself having atoning efficacy, the narrator's affirmation that the death had this effect, and the concluding celebration of the servant's virtue and achievement all parallel the author of 4th Maccabees' treatment of the Jewish martyrs. In the case of the Jesus tradition, the phrase "for many," in the two sayings in which Jesus interprets his own death as an act bringing benefit to others, echoes the prominence of the many who benefit from the servant's sufferings in Isaiah 53:11-12. His intent to give his life could be heard as an abbreviated paraphrase of Isaiah 53:10, when you make his life an offering for sin. The ransom saying concerning the Son of Man who came to serve and give his life as a ransom for many can be regarded as an appropriate summary of the career of the servant of Isaiah 53, 4-12, who offered his life as a substitute for the many. Moreover, other sayings attributed to Jesus regarding his own suffering point to the paradigm of Isaiah 53, namely the assumption that the scriptures speak about the Son of Man suffering many things and being treated with contempt, which resonates conceptually and even linguistically with the terms suffer and treat with contempt in certain versions of certain Greek versions of Isaiah 53. The paradigm of the Maccabean martyrs, especially as developed in the trajectory leading from 2nd Maccabees toward 4th Maccabees, reinforces such a reading of Isaiah 53 as a divine appointment of a righteous individual's death to be suffered on behalf of the people. The words of Jesus at the Last Supper continue to be informed by the paradigm of the suffering servant, as already seen. These words, however, move explicitly sacrificial and cultic imagery to the foreground in the interpretation of Jesus' death. A scholar named Joachim Jeremias observed that the separate attention given to the body and to the blood in the words and acts at the Last Supper in itself recalls the Levitical sacrifices, in which blood is separated from the sacrificial animal's body and poured out as a separate act from the ritual handling of the flesh, the body, of the victim. Sacrificial imagery is not foreign to Isaiah 53. The phrase poured out for many, suggestive of the sacrificial disposition of the blood of a sacrificial victim, echoes Isaiah 53:12. He poured out himself to death. And the servant's life is made by God an offering for sin, bearing the sins of many. Jewish martyrological texts, however, are even more explicit about the death of a righteous person, indeed specific named righteous persons, functioning as a propitiatory or expiatory sacrifice, as in the prayer of Azariah and most explicitly in 4th Maccabees, down to the mention of the martyr's blood as a purificatory agent and their deaths as propitiatory offerings. In the Jesus tradition, Jesus appears to combine the image of the sacrifice of atonement, blood poured out for many, resonating with the restorative effects of the deaths of the martyrs and the suffering servant on the divine-human relationship, and the sacrifice of covenant inauguration, the blood of the covenant, specifically recontextualizing a phrase from Exodus 24:8, the original covenant inauguration ritual. Peter Stuhlmacher has observed how these two rites are already blended in certain targumim on Exodus 24:8, that is, Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible, where the blood of the covenant is sprinkled on the altar to make atonement for the people. To what extent these texts represent Jesus' self-understanding in regard to his own death depends on one's assessment of their authenticity. A significant case has been made, affirming the authenticity of these sayings, allowing for the problem of recovering the likely Aramaic of Jesus' original, and are prepared to see in them a genuine reflection of Jesus' own approach to his death. Jesus then would be seen deeply to be influenced by the tradition of Jewish martyrology, both the deaths of the prophets and the obedient deaths of the martyrs who gave their lives for the sake of securing divine benefits for the nation, understood within the framework of covenant renewal, or even new covenant inauguration. Jesus' contemporaries, at least those who were favorably disposed toward him and his ministry, were certainly poised to interpret his death in terms of these traditions, as seen throughout the literary reflections on his death left by his followers in the New Testament. Many of these followers, moreover, understood themselves to continue in that tradition, anticipating that their calling involved not only serving as the servant of the Lord came to serve, but also giving their lives in obedient witness to God, as did Jesus. This understanding extended to the establishment of the new covenant promised by Jeremiah, seen from the additions to Jesus' original words of institution in Luke, the new covenant in my blood, and in Matthew, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. That is to say, in both of these versions of the same words, we probably see some level of interpretation of Jesus talking about the blood of the covenant, referring, of course, to his own blood, in Luke specifying this as the new covenant, or Matthew spelling out that it is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. This emphasis on the forgiveness of sins, the hallmark of Jeremiah's new covenant, appears also in the naming of Jesus in Matthew. Jesus' first declaration about the purpose of his mission, namely to forgive sins, and the proclamation of forgiveness in Jesus' name after his passion. This tradition reaches its pinnacle, of course, in the central argumentative section of the Epistle to the Hebrews, where the connection between the inauguration of Jeremiah's new covenant and the sacrificial self-offering of Jesus are treated extensively. It is entirely plausible, however, that Jesus would have regarded this new covenant differently from the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews. For example, because the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews sees in it the abrogation of the Torah as the document that defines the relationship between God and God's people. Jesus may have understood his death more in keeping with the view attributed to the martyrs in both 2nd and 4th Maccabees, namely that it was an act of covenant maintenance, renewing obedience on the part of the people and a favorable disposition on the part of God. Early Christian literature outside the Gospels shows just how fruitful and pervasive the interpretation of Jesus' death in line with the martyrological tradition was among Jesus' contemporaries and the succeeding generation. The martyrs themselves are used as moral examples of the virtue of faithfulness, pistis, toward God and God's promises in Hebrews 11:35b, and the example of Jesus, who endured a cross despising shame, in Hebrews 12:12, is portrayed in martyrological language, recalling Eleazar's bold stance as he endured the pains and scorned the compulsions. These early Christian authors often used language to interpret the significance of Jesus' violent death, similar to the language used by the author of 4th Maccabees to interpret the violent deaths of the martyrs. Just as Eleazar's blood was seen to have purificatory efficacy, so Jesus' blood is said to be a purifying or atoning agent throughout the epistolary literature of the New Testament. Like the Maccabean martyrs, Jesus is set forward as a propitiatory sacrifice, an offering that propitiates the deity who has been alienated by human sinfulness. Although the word antipsuchon recedes before terms more explicitly connected with ransoming, like antilutron, the notion of Jesus' life being given in exchange for others remains prominent under this new term, or in terms of dying on behalf of others, often specifically on account of the sins of many or all, so that these sins are passed over by God, resonating with the deaths of the martyrs as a ransom for the sins of the nation in 4th Maccabees 17. This reconciliation between God and God's people, his own servants, and the turning away of God's wrath was promoted by the martyrs' deaths in 2nd Maccabees. Reconciliation becomes a key term describing the results of Jesus' death for the divine-human relationship in texts like Romans 5 and 2 Corinthians 5, which also involves the removal of people from the sphere of God's wrath. The sacrificial language never obscures the fact that it was Jesus' obedience unto death like the obedience of the martyrs that was the essential component for God's acceptance of his offering as an act that would reconcile God's self to sinful people. The scope of that reconciliation, of course, is seen to be much broader in the case of early Christian reflection on the death of Jesus, transcending ethnic boundaries, reaching to both Jew and Gentile. In both the paradigm of the martyrs and the case of Jesus, reconciliation between God and the disobedient people is only one facet of the achievement of those who are obedient unto death. Just as the exemplary deaths of the martyrs revived covenant obedience among the people, the death of Jesus also results in a return to obedience among the community of the reconciled, for example in Romans 8, 2-4 and 7-8, and thereby the enjoyment of peace with God and the restoration of God's favor. It is highly probable that 4th Maccabees was written later than many of the New Testament documents. Nevertheless, the conceptual and linguistic parallelism between early Christian reflection on Jesus' death and early Jewish reflection on the deaths of martyrs suggests strongly that the developments in the Jewish martyrological tradition reflected in the former deeply informed the latter. While study of background material like the Old Testament Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha will not by itself solve the important questions about the historical Jesus raised earlier in this presentation, familiarity with this literature, particularly the traditions about the deaths of the prophets and the significance of the deaths of the righteous martyrs, does provide evidence in support of several key premises. First, Jesus had access to the traditional resources that would have allowed him to anticipate his death as a result of his confronting the authorities in Jerusalem. Second, whether or not Jesus interpreted Isaiah 53 as a messianic paradigm, and one that he would himself enact, the traditions concerning the deaths of the martyrs provided him with the precedent for viewing his own death as an offering of covenant loyalty to God that would positively affect God's relationship with the people as a whole, or his disciples in particular. Texts like 2nd and 4th Maccabees, moreover, richly inform the early church's reflection on the significance of Jesus' death, providing a bridge to the church's reading of texts like Isaiah 53 as a prophecy of the redemptive death of the Messiah, as well as the church's reflection on its own calling to bear witness, showing faithfulness unto death itself.